Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever recorded in Tennessee. Before we begin, share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's fascinating to see the places and hours when these forgotten stories find their way back into the world. Let's begin. In the late autumn of 1885, a pale mist lingered over the winding road that cut through the Cumberland foothills. Travelers passing that stretch often spoke of a faint smell in the air, not unpleasant, just strange, like roasted herbs and something faintly metallic. The smell always seemed to come from a low wooden building set back from the bend, a modest inn known to wagon drivers and peddlers as Willet Sisters Rest House. It was run by two women whose origins no one could clearly trace. Some said they'd come from Mississippi after the war, others from the burned outskirts of Nashville. Their names, Martha and Eliza Willet, appeared only once in the old county register, entered by a clerk whose penmanship drowned their surname in ink. They were described as quiet, respectful, well-mannered, though neighbors recalled a certain unease that lingered in their presence, the kind that settles in a room without reason. The inn had only 4 rooms, each lit by oil lamps that gave off a dull yellow glow. It stood along the trade route between Pulaski and Decatur, a weary stretch of mud, dust, and creek crossings. By night, the surrounding hollows echoed with frogs and owls, and the faint rumble of wagons carrying grain or timber. The sisters rarely ventured into town. Instead, they kept to their routine, baking, tending their herb garden, and preparing hearty meals for whoever stopped to rest. No one knew much about the guests who stayed there. Wagoners said they were treated well, stew with fresh vegetables, bread still warm, a pitcher of spring water. Yet every few months someone passing through would ask after a companion who had last been seen near the Willet Inn. The sheriff in Columbia once made inquiries, but found no evidence of foul play, just a ledger with neat handwriting and each guest's name marked as departed. It was during one of these inquiries that the first strange rumor took root. A tanner named Ephraim Cobb claimed that one night while staying at the inn, he had seen Martha carrying a sack down toward the smokehouse well after midnight. When asked what he'd seen, he hesitated, then said he heard the sound of metal scraping stone. He didn't stay another night. Cobb told the sheriff he'd felt the air change, as if the ground itself had gone hollow. In early 1886, an earthquake tremor rippled across parts of western Tennessee. Newspapers later referred to it as the Jackson Quake, a mild precursor to something larger that would shake the region that summer. But at the time, locals noticed more than shifting ground. The Willet Inn's chimney cracked, and one wall bowed inward. During repairs, the mason uncovered a hollow section behind the hearth filled with ash, bone fragments and something blackened that smelled of fat and lime. The sheriff sealed the area and took samples to the county seat. Officially, no report survives. The courthouse records for that year were partially destroyed when the same quake damaged the Columbia archive. But an unsigned note was found decades later in a bound ledger describing small bones of uncertain origin, scorched and intermingled with stove refuse. No charges were filed. The sheriff, one Amos Greeley, reportedly left town soon after. What happened next is pieced together from recollections of a local widow, Mrs. Dorcas Hume, who supplied milk to the Willet sisters twice a week. She testified years later that she began noticing new barrels arriving at the inn every month, delivered by night wagons from as far as Huntsville. When she asked about them, Eliza told her they were for storing preserves. But one morning Dorcas saw a cooper prying open an empty barrel behind the kitchen. Inside, she claimed, was a dark residue and a faint smell she couldn't place. The inn's popularity never waned. On Sundays, travelers lined up for their famous stew. Some said it was beef, others swore it tasted of wild game. Martha, the elder, was meticulous in her cooking, always stirring with the same long-handled ladle, always humming under her breath. Eliza tended to the rooms and collected payment. They refused silver coins, insisting on notes only, which they stored in a metal tin behind the counter. The first recorded disappearance linked directly to the Willet Inn came in May of that year. A carpenter named Jonah Hill, hired to repair the quake damage, vanished after his second night's stay. His tools were found neatly stacked in the shed. When his brother came searching, Martha told him Jonah had left before dawn to catch a wagon to Nashville. No witness ever confirmed seeing him. Later, townsfolk recalled a faint odor drifting from the smokehouse behind the inn that week. The sheriff again visited, found nothing amiss, and closed the inquiry. But whispers began spreading through the hills, of women who could make a man disappear without a sound. By autumn, the inn's reputation turned darker. Travelers began avoiding the bend altogether, choosing longer routes. Even then, a few desperate souls still came, drawn by the promise of food and rest. One of them, a young preacher from Selma, left behind a journal found many years later in the attic of a church rectory. His final entry read, "The Willet women are kind, but something in the kitchen moves when no one stands there. I cannot sleep for the sound of scraping." That entry was dated November 11, 1886, 2 days before the larger Jackson earthquake shook the region again. Witnesses claimed that after that quake, the inn's chimney collapsed completely, setting off a small fire. By the time neighbors arrived, the sisters were gone. Only the stew pot remained, still warm, the broth half spilled across the floor. The sheriff's men found no trace of them, only the smell that lingered long after the smoke cleared, and an iron pot, whose bottom was fused with something that refused to wash away. And so began the strange silence that would surround the Willet Inn for the next 40 years. By the time the smoke cleared over the Willet Inn, nothing remained but scorched timber and the warped outline of the stove. Sheriff Amos Greeley returned with a handful of men to document what they could, though few dared to step across the threshold. The air was heavy with a smell that seemed to cling to skin and hair, sweet and rancid at once. What little light filtered through the broken rafters revealed stains on the floorboards that no one wanted to identify aloud. The ledger was gone. So were the barrels. Only fragments of crockery and the metal clasp of a trunk were found in the ash pile near the back room. The sheriff ordered the remains buried under a heap of dirt to prevent scavengers. It was said that even the dogs refused to approach. Within days, word spread through Giles and Maury counties that the Willet sisters had perished in the blaze. Others swore they had been seen on the northern road that same night, walking side by side under the moon, each carrying a small bundle wrapped in linen. No stagecoach ever reported taking them aboard, yet a week later, a traveller claimed to have seen 2 women matching their description near Waynesboro, moving west. County officials tried to quiet the rumours, framing the event as a tragic fire, caused by a faulty chimney weakened during the 1886 Jackson earthquake. But in private, investigators whispered about the peculiar findings. A deputy, Thomas Crane, later recounted that he uncovered a half-burned ledger fragment wedged behind a beam. On it, faint pencil marks spelled out 4 names, none recognized. Locally, and beside them, short notations, settled, with broth, and gone. That scrap was never entered into evidence. The courthouse clerk refused to log it, claiming such hearsay relics would only attract hysteria. Yet Crane kept it in his pocket for years, showing it to travelers who mentioned the Willets. One of them, an itinerant photographer named Klein, copied the words into his own journal, which would resurface decades later among his glass negatives. For months after the fire, townsfolk avoided the site. Weeds overtook the charred foundation, and the nearby creek, once used for washing linens, turned a sickly hue. Livestock refused to drink from it. In spring, children who strayed too close spoke of seeing shapes in the water, dark, drifting forms that vanished when touched. The local doctor dismissed it as runoff from ash and lime, but others said the ground had taken memory, that what was cooked and buried there would never rest easy. That same year in Pulaski, a drifter was arrested for selling cutlery bearing the initials M.W. and E.W. When questioned, he claimed he had bought the items from a pale woman traveling alone with a horse cart, somewhere along the Duck River. He described her as polite, soft-spoken with a bandaged hand. When the sheriff pressed for details, the man recanted, saying he'd been drunk. The knives were confiscated, but later went missing from the evidence chest. The Jackson quake struck, again that summer, shaking the region and collapsing 2 bridges. Amid the chaos, all remaining mention of the Willet sisters disappeared from the county papers. The local press focused on rebuilding, on harvest losses, on the strange fissures that opened near old wells. Only one column, a brief paragraph, in the Tennessee Gazette, referred to a disreputable innkeeper family long vanished, noting that their property would revert to the state due to unpaid taxes. Still in the hollows, their name persisted. Teamsters refused to camp near the ruins. Lantern lights were seen at night where the inn had once stood. The widow Hume, who once supplied them milk, told a preacher she heard voices near the creek. Whenever she passed after dusk, women's voices murmuring a hymn too faint to understand. The preacher urged her to pray and not to return. 10 years later, in 1896, a new road survey cut through the overgrown lot. Labourers digging for foundation stones uncovered a wooden box filled with preserved jars sealed in wax. Each jar contained what appeared to be dried roots, but when opened, the contents crumbled into fine grey dust that carried an odour like iron and smoke. The county physician, Dr. Cleary, noted in his field report that one jar held a small piece of cloth with initials J.H. embroidered in red thread, possibly Jonah Hill, the carpenter who had vanished before the fire. The jars were sent to Nashville for examination and never returned. Dr. Cleary later wrote in a private letter, "The contents bore a resemblance to calcined matter, inconsistent with any known preservation method." That line was quietly struck from the public record. Through the 1890s, a handful of travellers still claimed to encounter a lone woman offering stew and lodging near the Tennessee River crossing, 20 miles west of Columbia. Her name was never asked. Her voice, by all accounts, was measured and kind. She served meals from a covered pot, never ate herself, and disappeared before dawn. Those who slept under her roof reported hearing footsteps in the kitchen through the night and the faint scrape of metal on stone, a sound no one could locate. In 1902, a small chapel was built near the former inn site, its congregation unaware of what lay beneath. The first pastor, Reverend Hobart Miles, wrote that parishioners often complained of a heaviness of air during evening services. Once, while repairing the pulpit, he discovered fragments of charred wood embedded in the soil, and beneath them a blackened iron pot fused to stone. He had it buried behind the churchyard wall. By 1910, the last witnesses were gone. Sheriff. Greeley had died in exile in Arkansas, his diary sealed by his nephew. In it, one line stood apart from the rest, written shaky and near illegible. They knew what was in the broth. When the diary surfaced in 1920, it reignited interest in the case. Reporters from Memphis sought to locate any living kin of the Willet sisters. None were found. The old property was excavated again, and deeper beneath the main hearth they uncovered a hollow lined with stones, a crude cellar. Inside were remnants of ceramic dishes, utensils, and bones too small to belong to livestock. The examiner wrote simply, "Human origin not confirmed," and closed the file. In later years, those who passed the site said the earth there never stayed level. Rain pooled unnaturally, and grass grew in uneven patches. Children from the nearby school called it the Hollow Kitchen. Even as roads modernized and farms vanished, the name endured, a whispered marker on old county maps that no surveyor wanted to erase. Locals say that if you walk that stretch in autumn, when the air grows damp and the scent of burning leaves fills the hollows, you might still catch the faint smell of stew thick with herbs drifting across the empty road, and the echo of a woman's voice humming softly somewhere behind the trees. By the second decade of the century, the case of the Willet sisters had become more rumor than record. An unspoken caution passed between generations, yet among certain officials, especially those charged with cataloging the aftermath of the Jackson earthquake, their names still appeared in marginal notes. When Tennessee began reconstructing lost county archives in 1912, a young clerk named Samuel H. Pritchard was tasked with reviewing incomplete ledgers from Maury County. Within the yellowed pages, he found one labeled simply Register of Domestic Licenses and Hospitality Permits, 1885-1886. Most entries were mundane, blacksmiths, mill owners, boarding houses, but one line caught his eye. Willet Sisters Rest, operating without renewal since April. In the remarks column, written in a faded hand, were 3 words, pending moral review. Pritchard brought the ledger to his supervisor, who instructed him to file it under irregular commerce. Yet he made a private copy before returning it, and decades later, his transcription would serve. as the only verifiable evidence that the inn had indeed been under investigation before it burned. That small discovery reignited interest among amateur historians and local pastors who viewed the Willet story as a parable of sin and secrecy. Church pamphlets began circulating in Columbia and Pulaski, warning women against idle enterprises run apart from righteous oversight. Some claimed the sisters had practiced witchcraft. Others called them con artists, but a few, notably Reverend Miles from the chapel near the ruins, spoke in quieter tones. "If they were guilty," he once said, "then the earth took its vengeance swiftly as it did upon Jackson." The comparison was not lost on listeners. The 1886 Jackson earthquake had destroyed much of central Tennessee's record-keeping infrastructure, and the coincidence of its timing with the Willet case carried a kind of grim poetry. In later oral accounts, townspeople spoke as if the tremors had been divine retribution, not for what the sisters did, but for what the community ignored. Around this time, a retired deputy named Thomas Crane, the same who once kept the ledger fragment, resurfaced in a Nashville infirmary. Old and nearly blind, he dictated a statement to a nurse, insisting that the women were no monsters, but desperate souls. He claimed that after the fire, Sheriff Greeley ordered all remaining notes burned to prevent further disgrace to the county. But Crane confessed he had hidden one item, a brass locket containing a photograph of two women standing before the inn, both unsmiling. One holding a ladle. On the back, faintly scratched into the metal, were the words, "Not all was served." The locket was later sent to the State Archive but went missing during transfer. Still, Crane's testimony drew journalists from Nashville who hoped to turn the tale into a human interest column. The Gazette ran a brief article titled "The Cooks of Hollow Bend," but it was quickly retracted after local families complained that such stories invited ridicule upon the region. In 1915, construction began on a new rail spur connecting Columbia to Waynesboro. Laborers clearing brush near the old inn site unearthed fragments of pottery, rusted utensils, and something else, a small iron tag stamped B3. Engineers assumed it was from freight equipment, but a physician later noted that similar tags had been used in county poorhouses to mark unclaimed remains. How it ended up buried near the Willet property was never determined. A decade later, a historian named Beatrice Morvan compiled a private index of unsolved disappearances from southern Tennessee. In her notes, she identified at least 9 individuals last recorded traveling between Pulaski and Decatur between 1883 and 1886. Of those, 3 were known to have passed the Willet Inn. Her typewritten manuscript, later preserved at the University of Memphis, remarks every account speaks of warmth, hospitality, and fine food, but not one of the travelers is seen again after remarking on the peculiar sweetness of the stew. That phrase, peculiar sweetness, appeared again in 1923. When a letter surfaced in an estate sale belonging to Dr. Cleary, the physician who examined the jars found in 1896. The letter, never mailed, was addressed to the county coroner. It read, "I can no longer pretend ignorance. The residue from those jars was not mineral. It bore human trace. The sisters were preserving, not storing. No official reaction was recorded. By the time the letter was discovered, Cleary had been dead for 20 years, and the county office had no surviving coroner from that era." Still, the letter's existence spurred local gossip anew, and for a brief period the ruins became a place of morbid pilgrimage. Travelers came by automobile now, parking along the dirt road to glimpse the site where the women of the broth had lived. They found only a depression in the soil, a few bricks, and the stump of the old smokehouse oak. Some swore the air smelled faintly of meat and iron when the wind shifted east. In 1925, a Nashville reporter named C. Edwin Lane published a serialized account titled "The Willet Sisters and the Devil's Recipe." His version exaggerated nearly every detail, claiming the women had been excommunicated nuns or failed midwives, but he based his geography precisely on known routes. Lane interviewed several elderly residents who remembered hearing their parents speak of the broth fire. One, an 80-year-old farmer, recalled his father's words, "They weren't evil, just hungry. The war left some folk too hollow to be fed." That line struck a chord with readers. Some sympathized. Others called for the ruins to be exorcised. The county responded by fencing off the area, declaring it historically sensitive. A wooden sign was placed at the road's edge. No trespass, private study. It remains unclear who owned the land. From there, the story drifted again into half-silence. Yet in 1930, during another mild tremor in western Tennessee, the ground near Hollow Bend split along the creek. Locals found shards of pottery and bone washing out with the current. A schoolteacher collected several pieces and sent them to a museum in Chattanooga. When the curator examined them, he noted that the glaze bore traces of sodium and fat, consistent with cooking pots. He sent a polite reply to the teacher. Artifacts received. Origin domestic. In the same month, parishioners at the nearby chapel reported hearing the organ play a few chords after service, though no one had touched it. Reverend Miles had died years earlier, but his successor found an old note pinned under the pulpit cloth. It read simply, "Keep the hymns gentle. They do not like noise." From that point, no official documents mention the Willets again. The state closed its file, marking the case unresolved and presumed mythic. But among local families, their memory endured through small signs. An unclaimed recipe written in spidery ink, a tarnished spoon passed down without explanation, a refusal to eat stew on Sundays. Even now, older residents of the valley say that the silence along that road isn't empty at all. It's listening. When the wind moves through the hollow after dusk, the reeds by the creek whistle like a pot just beginning to boil. Some travelers swear they've smelled broth, faint and sweet, drifting through the fog. Others hear the scrape of metal and think it's the sound of their own wagon wheel. Those who linger too long say otherwise. They say the air thickens as if tasting itself, remembering. By the early 1930s, the Willet story had slipped somewhere between documented tragedy and whispered folklore. Yet as Tennessee entered the Great Depression, folklorists funded by the Works Progress Administration began gathering rural ghost stories for their cultural archives. Among the collectors was Margaret Fenn, a soft-spoken researcher from Knoxville, who traveled county to county recording oral histories on wax cylinders. In 1934, she arrived in Giles County and, while staying in Columbia, first heard mention of the sisters who fed the road. She noted the phrase in her field diary. Locals speak of an inn burned after the quake, of stew that sang when stirred. The imagery fascinated her. On 12th June 1934, she visited the old chapel built near the site and interviewed Reverend Hale, successor to the late Reverend Miles. He described persistent trouble keeping congregation numbers steady. Folks come for weddings, he told her, but not for suppers. They say the smell returns when meat is cooked indoors. Fenn's recordings, stored today at the University of Tennessee archives, preserve faint static and a woman's trembling voice recounting the legend. Two women, Martha and Eliza Willet, they made travelers welcome. Then one night, thunder below the ground. Afterward, pot still boiling, no one left to serve. Fenn, skeptical of superstition, sought documentary corroboration. She tracked down the retired clerk Samuel Pritchard, then in his 70s, who confirmed that he had once seen the permit ledger marked pending moral review. He told her he destroyed his copy after receiving anonymous letters, warning him to let the broth cool. He would not say who sent them. The following winter brought severe flooding along the Duck River. When waters receded, townspeople found fragments of brick and pottery scattered across newly cut banks. Among them was an iron lid etched crudely with initials EW, later displayed in a small county exhibition labeled Domestic Relic, circa 1880s. Fenn photographed it, describing the object as blackened yet polished smooth, as though long-handled. By 1937, her field notes had drawn attention from the Tennessee Historical Society. She was asked to prepare a formal monograph on the case. Working in Nashville, she examined what remained of Sheriff Greeley's correspondence. One letter dated February 1887 referenced unclaimed trunks containing bones of varied measure, stored in courthouse basement. The letter ended abruptly with the words, "Further classification suspended by order of safety." It was signed but never countersigned. Fenn's manuscript, The Willet Sisters of Hollow Bend, was completed in 1938 but never published. Her editor deemed it unfit for civic morale. Only one carbon copy survived. found decades later in a library clearance box. In the margins, she had written a private reflection. Perhaps the horror lies not in what they did, but in how calmly the earth accepted it. That same year, an earthquake of small magnitude shook parts of western Tennessee, the first significant tremor since the 1886 Jackson earthquake that had shattered records half a century earlier. In Columbia, cracks reopened along the chapel wall. Parishioners reported hearing distant clattering during services, like pots striking stone below the floor. The pastor attributed it to settling ground. Others recalled the legend. During reconstruction of the foundation, masons uncovered a sealed niche beneath the nave, containing two objects wrapped in decayed linen, a rusted ladle and a thin, curved bone resembling a human radius. The items were reburied quietly and work resumed. Only a single note in the parish ledger marked the discovery. Tools returned to rest. Meanwhile, the legend gained new life among travelers. Depression-era drifters camped near Hollow Bend, leaving chalk symbols on fence posts, 3 circles for safe water, a cross for danger, and occasionally a small spiral meaning food offered. Folklorists later observed that the spiral appeared nowhere else in regional hobo code. It was unique to the valley. When asked its meaning, one old wanderer explained, "It means you'll be fed, but you won't stay." In 1941, with America on the brink of war, a Nashville radio program titled Southern Shadows dramatized the story of the Willet House. Actors portrayed the sisters as tragic heroines driven to madness by hunger. The broadcast drew hundreds of letters, some from listeners who claimed the portrayal was blasphemous, others insisting they had family who ate from that pot. One letter, unsigned, arrived wrapped around a small spoon tarnished black. The envelope bore no return address, only the words for proof. A month later, Margaret Fenn disappeared while traveling between counties on assignment. Her automobile was found abandoned near Centerville, doors locked, luggage intact. The last entry in her notebook read, "Returning to Hollow Bend for final verification, air smells of broth." Her body was never recovered. Newspapers reported it as an accident near the flooded creek, but locals believed otherwise. For years afterward, travelers claimed to see a woman walking the bend at dusk, notebook in hand, staring toward the ground as if listening. Following Fenn's disappearance, state offices ordered the entire folklore collection sealed, pending moral review, repeating the same phrase once written beside the Willet permit. War soon overshadowed all. Hollow Bend fell silent again, its story confined to private recollection. Yet during the blackout years of 1944, soldiers stationed nearby told of hearing singing when night patrols passed the bend, 2 women's voices, harmonizing on an unfamiliar hymn. Patrol reports dismissed it as wind through reeds. Still, one officer, Captain Larson, noted that the song seemed to come from beneath the earth. When peace returned, the road was widened, cutting directly over the old foundation stones. Workers pouring asphalt discovered the soil beneath was darker than elsewhere, rich, oily, resistant to compaction. The foreman, impatient to finish, ordered more gravel. A young laborer later recounted that as the rollers pressed down, steam rose briefly from the surface carrying a scent of herbs and something sweet. By 1947, Hollow Bend had no structures left standing. The chapel closed, and its bell was moved to another parish. The last service ended quietly with the hymn, "Come Ye Weary." Parishioners later said the echo of that song lingered longer than any before, stretching out through the trees until it sounded like humming. The legend persisted only in the smallest ways, a recipe card kept in a family Bible, a photograph half burned, showing 2 women at a wooden table, the faint outline of pots behind them. When collectors tried to trace the image, no photographer's mark appeared on the back. The paper stock dated to the 1880s, consistent with the timeline of the inn. By mid-century, the Willet case was officially classified by historians as regional mythos derived from post-seismic folklore. Yet travelers still paused near the unmarked curve. Some claimed their engines faltered there, or that the smell of soup wafted through open windows, though no house stood within miles. Old men sitting at gas stations along the highway would nod toward the bend and say, "That's where the sisters cooked." When asked what they meant, they'd shrug. "Cooked folks, cooked time, who knows? But don't stop there hungry." Even now, when rain soaks the Tennessee clay and the ground releases its deep-stored heat, locals swear the steam that rises across that stretch carries more than water. They say it carries memory, the breath of every story the county tried to bury rising again, warm and silent, tasting faintly of herbs. After the war, the name Willet surfaced again in a context no one expected. In 1952, the Tennessee Historical Review published a short article titled "Forgotten Industries of the Cumberland South." Buried near the end, amid paragraphs about sorghum presses and brick kilns, was a single line crediting the Willet Inn of Giles County, in 1883, for serving travelers before its destruction, in the tremors of '86. No mention of the sisters, no mention of stew. Yet those who still remembered recognized the name immediately. The article stirred quiet curiosity among university researchers eager to catalogue vanishing folk traditions. That same year, a graduate student from Vanderbilt, Edna K. Rowe, undertook a field survey of abandoned post-war settlements. When she reached Hollow Bend, she found little more than a depression in the soil and the outline of a collapsed stone wall. She gathered samples for analysis and took several photographs using a Rolleiflex camera. One image, later preserved in her thesis appendix, shows the ridge at dusk. No visible structures, yet faint streaks of light appear along the ground like threads of mist. Rowe wrote beneath it, "Long exposure, unaccounted for illumination." Rowe's interviews with residents were uneasy. Most refused to discuss the sisters, insisting the subject spoiled appetite. But one elderly woman, Cora Hume, granddaughter of the milk supplier Dorcas Hume, spoke reluctantly. "They were proper women," she said, "but something in their eyes said they had tasted the war." Cora described hearing her grandmother mutter about jars that hummed when opened. Rowe pressed for details. The woman crossed herself and whispered, "You dig deep enough there. The earth will feed you back." Rowe returned to Nashville, convinced that remnants of the Willet household still lay beneath the modern road. She petitioned the county for limited excavation rights, but permission was denied on grounds of safety and religious sensitivity. Her notes mention receiving anonymous calls advising her to leave the sisters where they are. Within months, her funding was withdrawn, her thesis completed without conclusion. She moved north and never returned to Tennessee. In 1956, construction crews widening Highway 43 struck a buried foundation stone carved with initials barely legible, M.W. The foreman, unaware of its significance, used it to reinforce a drainage ditch. That section of road has flooded repeatedly ever since, despite multiple repairs. Locals call it the Sunken Mile. The 1960s brought renewed academic interest in American folk crime. A writer for Harper's Southern Quarterly, Gerald Niles, sought to separate truth from rumor. He interviewed descendants of law officers and uncovered a faded photograph of Sheriff Greeley posing beside an evidence table. In the lower corner, a round pot gleamed under lamplight. Niles enlarged the image and noted what appeared to be teeth embedded in the metal's reflection. Editors dismissed it as artifacting. The photo nevertheless became a subject of campus legend, copied endlessly in mimeograph circles under the caption, "The Broth Pot." In 1964, a traveling evangelist, Pastor Wendell Reese, held a revival tent near Columbia. On the third night, he preached about sin that boils unseen beneath the soil. When thunder rolled, the tent lights flickered and a pot used for communal stew overturned without anyone touching it. Witnesses described the spilled stew as unusually dark, smelling faintly of iron. Reese declared it a sign and dismantled the meeting before dawn. The field where it occurred has never grown crops evenly since. That same summer, a set of anonymous letters reached the state archive, each written in uneven script. "Do not pave the hollow again." The ground moves when fed heat. Investigators traced the postmarks to different towns. Handwriting experts concluded multiple authors, perhaps following local superstition revived after the evangelist's incident. By 1969, Tennessee State University launched an oral history project documenting racial and economic life in the postbellum South. Interviewers in Giles County kept encountering the Willet narrative woven into family recollections, though now the sisters were described as avengers feeding corrupt travelers their own greed. The story had transformed. Less horror, more moral allegory. Yet one recording stood apart. A man identified only as Eli C. recounted working road repair near the bend and finding a spoon still warm though the sun was gone. He swore it burned his hand. The tape ends with silence and a faint humming. Archivists later noted the sound persisted for 23 seconds after the reel stopped spinning. In 1972, heavy rains collapsed part of the embankment above the creek. A maintenance crew discovered a small void beneath the asphalt, filled with blackened clay. When examined, the soil emitted a persistent warmth. A geologist from Memphis tested it, recording a surface temperature 10 degrees higher than surrounding ground, despite overcast weather. His report concluded, anomalous geothermal activity of undetermined cause. The phenomenon ceased within a week. Around that period, a regional newspaper attempted a retrospective titled Tennessee's Unburied Legends, and the editor received a photograph in the mail showing two women in Victorian attire standing beside what seemed to be a stove. Across the bottom, in neat handwriting, Pulaski Road, 1885. The editor printed it without context. Days later, a man claiming to be a descendant of Sheriff Greeley demanded its removal, calling it family property. The negative vanished from the archives soon after. By the late 1970s, Hollow Bend existed only as a line of uneven asphalt shadowed by sycamores. Truckers told of radio static surging through that mile, of faint singing when headlights dimmed. Utility crews reported instruments failing, compasses wavering. One foreman kept a log noting each malfunction. The pattern coincided with heavy rain and strong southern winds, the same conditions recorded before the 1886 quake. When he mentioned this, his supervisor laughed and wrote across the margin, "Tell the Willet girls to keep it down." In 1979, local historian Howard Pritchard, grandson of the clerk Samuel, attempted to publish a book collecting all known materials. The manuscript titled Stew and Silence was completed, but refused by printers who feared lawsuits from families named Willet. Only 6 bound proofs were made. 2 survive. In its preface, Pritchard wrote, "What endures is not their crime, but our appetite for forgetting." He died that winter, leaving his notes to the county library. Weeks later, staff reported a lingering odor near the stacks where the boxes were stored, like cooked herbs. The library closed for fumigation. Nothing unusual was found. By the dawn of the 1980s, the Willet case belonged to no one, half folklore, half official silence. The road remained restless, the soil darker, the air heavier in late summer. Travelers who stopped nearby sometimes noticed condensation on their windshields, forming circular patterns, as if from unseen breath. Locals no longer told the story outright. They simply warned strangers not to camp by the creek, not to drink the water, and above all not to eat food offered by anyone who hummed while serving. By the beginning of the 1980s, the Willet legend had become a problem for Tennessee's Cultural Office. Tourism officials hoped to turn forgotten rural myths into roadside heritage stops, but Hollow Bend resisted every attempt at conversion. Surveyors sent to map the bend in 1982 reported their transit compasses drifting several degrees whenever they set the tripod within the former inn boundary. The head of the survey, David Alcott, wrote that his pencil markings would not hold straight lines. Funding was quietly pulled, and the site left unmarked once more. That same year, a Nashville television crew filmed a pilot for a local history series titled Shadows of the South. They intended to dramatize the Willet case using reenactors at sunset. Within minutes of recording, audio captured a low metallic scraping, followed by the host's microphone shorting out. The footage never aired. A production assistant later told a reporter that every take ended with the smell of broth. Station executives ordered the reels destroyed. But a single still photograph leaked. 2 actors seated at an empty table, both looking off camera toward something unseen. In the developed print, faint reflections like handprints appeared across the wall behind them. In 1984, local preservationists under Howard Pritchard Jr., nephew of the historian, proposed placing a simple wooden sign noting Willet Insight, 1885. Residents protested. "No need reminding what still cooks," one farmer told the county board. The motion failed 3-2. That autumn, vandals dumped several kitchen pots at the bend as a prank. 2 weeks later, those same boys were treated for chemical burns on their hands. The physician described the blisters as consistent with contact to heated metal. Night temperatures that week had not risen above 40 degrees. By 1986, the centennial of the Jackson earthquake, interest returned nationwide. Newspapers revisited regional disasters, and journalists once again invoked the sisters as victims of tremor-born hysteria. One article quoted a state archivist who admitted there was still a drawer labeled Willet, contents restricted. The drawer was said to contain 3 photographs, 1 ledger page, and an iron fragment sealed in wax. Week after publication, the archive's basement flooded. Inventory logs from that day list the drawer as missing, presumed relocated. During the 1990s, the area became a magnet for amateur paranormal groups. Camcorders recorded drifting fog, intermittent electromagnetic spikes, and what some claimed were voices repeating the words served. County police fined several trespassers for disturbing protected ground. Most visitors were teenagers seeking thrill, yet a few researchers arrived with more serious intent. Among them was Dr. Lois Maynard, an anthropologist from Vanderbilt specializing in ritual foodways. Her 1992 field diary describes uncovering shards of pottery bearing residue of animal fat and calcium phosphate, the same combination noted by Dr. Cleary a century earlier. Maynard submitted samples for lab analysis. The report returned inconclusive. 2 months later, she withdrew from the university citing health reasons. Her notes end mid-sentence. It wasn't famine. It was substitution. In 1995, a severe drought lowered the creek enough to reveal portions of the old foundation. Campers discovered a cast-iron handle fused into the stone, impossible to remove. One took photographs with a disposable camera. When developed, the first 6 frames were clear. The 7th showed only a dark swirl resembling rising steam. The following night, a brush fire swept through the same gully, stopping precisely at the foundation line as though the soil refused flame beyond it. That year also marked the final official attempt to memorialize Hollow Bend. The Tennessee Department of Conservation commissioned a short survey on sites of localized seismic disturbance. Field Agent Number 47 recorded ground temperature anomalies, identical to those measured in 1972, then added an unusual personal note, audible humming during measurement. Source undetermined. The final report omitted the sentence, replacing it with wind interference. In 1997, a young journalist, Nora Clay, wrote a feature for Southern Chronicle titled Where the Sisters Cooked. She described standing alone at twilight, hearing a faint rhythmic sound like a ladle stirring liquid. The article went to print accompanied by a photograph of the creek reflecting dusk light. Days later, Clay telephoned her editor, claiming her apartment smelled of stew, though she hadn't cooked. She left the city and never filed another story. Her camera, left behind, contained a single undeveloped roll. When processed, the negatives displayed overlapping ghost exposures resembling faces blurred by motion. By the century's end, Hollow Bend was removed from official maps, its coordinates folded into a wider conservation buffer labeled Private Timber Reserve. Satellite imagery showed nothing unusual except a darker patch of vegetation following the line of the old road. Still, truckers maintained the habit of tapping their horns when crossing the bend, for good luck. One driver told a folklorist that silence there felt heavier than noise, as if sound itself hesitated. Local families began sealing away heirlooms tied to the sisters. A silver spoon-etched EW resurfaced at an estate sale in 1998. The buyer returned it the next morning, claiming the utensil had grown warm in her hand. Another relic, a cracked recipe book listing measurements in teaspoons of ash, was donated anonymously to the county museum and placed in cold storage. Staff noted condensation forming inside its display case, despite controlled humidity. Near the turn of the millennium, an engineering team testing fiber optic cables through the region logged a single unexplained data pulse lasting 4 seconds, described as metallic resonance. The timestamp corresponded almost exactly to the anniversary week of the original fire, 114 years prior. The technicians, unaware of the date, simply marked it interference, culinary zone. The term, half-joking, remains in the equipment glossary. By 1999, Hollow Bend's legend had evolved into a cautionary tale against unchecked appetite, taught in local schools under folklore units. Teachers presented it stripped of gore. Two women who fed travelers kindness and vanished, leaving only warmth in the ground. Yet students visiting the area for field trips often returned nauseated, complaining of a taste of iron in the air. Teachers dismissed it as imagination, or perhaps the lingering minerals of the creek. As the millennium closed, the bend lay silent again, hidden under layers of asphalt and official forgetfulness. But the air, locals said, still changed when dusk settled, growing thick, fragrant, watchful. Travelers who paused too long sometimes swore they heard the scrape of iron from somewhere beneath the road, slow and circular, as if an unseen hand continued to stir what history refused to cool. When the century turned, most assumed the Willet story had finished its long simmer, but in 2003 a quiet rediscovery began. A county digitization grant funded the scanning of forgotten courthouse ledgers. Among the faded pages, archivist Marjorie Penn found one image file labeled only Hospitality 1885. When opened, the document revealed a registration slip written in elegant script, Willet Sisters Rest House paid in full for 2. Beneath the names was an unsteady notation. Departed before dawn. Stu unsettled. Penn thought it a joke by some earlier clerk, yet the ink analysis confirmed it dated to the proper year. She mentioned the find during a historical society meeting. Within days, her office printer began producing blank pages that smelled faintly of broth whenever the machine overheated. That same year, a local teacher created an educational website mapping Tennessee's ghost legends. When she uploaded coordinates for Hollow Bend, the server crashed repeatedly. The log files showed hundreds of phantom hits from an IP range registered as Willet Rest. Network technicians dismissed it as a miscoded cache, but the requests continued for 3 nights, always between 11 p.m. and midnight. Each attempt carried a header line reading simply ladled true. By 2007, a documentary team from Knoxville, Eastlight Productions, proposed a short film, The Broth That Wouldn't Cool. They secured interviews with remaining locals and gained temporary access to the overgrown creek bed. Cameras rolled for 2 evenings. During playback, the audio track contained a low hum oscillating precisely at the same frequency as the background tremors recorded in 1886 near Jackson. Sound engineers, comparing spectrograms, confirmed the wave pattern matched archived seismograph paper preserved in Memphis. No one could explain why an identical signature appeared on modern equipment. Funding for the documentary ended abruptly. The raw footage remains unreleased. Later that autumn, hikers using GPS apps noticed the mapping signal near the bend behaving oddly. Digital compasses spun, then froze, pointing toward the creek. One user captured a panoramic photo showing a pale mist curling upward, despite no visible water movement. When posted online, the image gained thousands of views before deletion under copyright claim from an unknown account listing Willet Estate Trust. No such trust existed in county filings. In 2010, construction of a new fiber-line trench accidentally exposed brickwork. Workers reported a bubbling noise coming from the cavity as air escaped. Inside were 3 jars sealed with modern silicone, but containing what appeared to be century-old contents: dark fluid, sediment, faint odor of rosemary and iron. Hazmat officials removed them for safety. Weeks later, the storage manifest at the environmental lab read, "Samples consumed in test." The lab director denied knowledge of any analysis. That same winter, a graduate researcher in culinary anthropology, Jonas Miller, began compiling a digital timeline of rural food superstitions. He added the Willet legend almost as an afterthought. 2 nights later, his phone recorded an automatic voice memo at 2:11 a.m., a metallic rhythm repeating exactly 9 times before silence. He deleted the file, but his cloud backup restored it each morning until he renamed it servedfinal.mp3. When he played it for colleagues, the room filled with a faint smell of sage. By 2014, Hollow Bend's coordinates reappeared on updated GIS datasets as a restricted restoration corridor. Drones surveying flood damage captured thermal images showing one circular hotspot maintaining constant, shaped roughly like a cooking vessel. Officials blamed compost decay. The drone pilot later described feeling dizzy when reviewing the footage, as if someone whispered too close to the ear. In 2016, An anonymous user uploaded scanned pages from Howard Pritchard's lost manuscript, Stew and Silence, to an archive forum. The pages contained passages never printed, including one detailing a rumor that the Willet sisters had fed not only travelers, but an entire detachment of soldiers stranded after a storm. The moderator removed the post within hours, citing possible hoax, yet cached versions circulated. Readers noted a watermark faintly visible across each page, concentric rings like ripples in liquid. 2 years later, a storm toppled trees across the bend. Residents inspecting the debris found a section of asphalt sunken inward, perfectly round. From the hole rose steam, though rain still fell. A road engineer sampling the temperature wrote, "Ground at 100 degrees, stable for 72 hours despite saturation." When he returned to retest, the cavity had filled itself with soil overnight. By 2020, social media revived the Willet story as part of a trend for Appalachian true horrors. Short videos showed travelers stopping at the bend, placing pots on the asphalt, and waiting for condensation to form. Most recorded nothing, yet several clips captured faint fog rings expanding outward before abruptly vanishing. Comments filled with jokes about southern witches cooking Wi-Fi, but a few users noticed every clip distorted around the same frame count, exactly 1,286 milliseconds. They called it the quake mark. In 2022, during regional infrastructure upgrades, utility scanners detected subsurface cavities aligning with the outline of the old inn foundation. An excavation request was denied after sensors registered minor tremors localized only to that site. The report's final line read, "Recommend leave undisturbed. Material appears reactive to vibration." That same autumn, descendants of the Hume family held a small memorial near the bend, placing flowers by the creek. One attendee swore she heard 2 women humming a hymn she couldn't identify. Her phone recorded only wind, but the background frequency matched the archived wax cylinder collected by Margaret Fenn in 1934. The identical tone, faded yet exact, marked the first confirmed overlap between analog and digital evidence of the case. Now, in the quiet of modern Tennessee nights, Hollow Bend lies hidden beneath layers of asphalt and forgetting. Trucks still tap their horns as they cross. Sometimes the air shifts warm for no reason, smelling faintly of sage, fat, and something sweet. When rain pools on the road, circles appear, as though stirred from below. Those who know the story say it's just the sisters, keeping watch over their final supper, ensuring nothing truly cools in the soil that once held their fire. Others simply drive faster, not daring to look at the steam rising behind them. By 2023, the state's infrastructure maps listed Hollow Bend only as a subsidence mitigation zone. No coordinates, no history. Yet a handful of people still searched for what had once stood there. Among them was Elena Ward, a freelance archivist hired to audit the Department of Conservation's long-term storage drives. One morning, she opened a folder labeled Inactive, 1886 Seismic Chill Rest House. Inside were 42 thumbnails of scanned documents, all corrupted except the last. When she clicked it, the screen displayed a handwritten recipe, stew for 2, heat until the ground hums. She assumed it was a prank inserted by a bored technician until the office lights flickered and the room filled with a faint smell of thyme. Ward later reported the anomaly to her supervisor. The supervisor laughed, told her the Willet story was an old wives' tale, and advised running a virus scan. When the scan finished, every file on the external drive had renamed itself Served 1, Served 2, and so on. IT replaced the unit, logged the incident as data duplication fault. Ward transferred to another department soon after. Meanwhile, the Tennessee Folklore Project reopened its archive for digital exhibits. A team from the University of Memphis curated an online collection called Feasts of the Forgotten, featuring food-related legends. Hollow Bend's entry included Fenn's 1930s transcript, photographs from the 1950s survey, and a brief audio clip. Visitors who played the clip reported hearing, beneath the static, 2 alternating voices repeating a line that sounded like, "still warm." Technicians analyzing the waveform found alternating left-right stereo pulses that matched seismograph rhythms from the Jackson earthquake logs. Local historians debated whether the resonance was coincidence or hoax. Yet one by one, the project's curators removed the file, claiming sound degradation. The removal notes all bore the same timestamp. 11:47 p.m. The hour folklore said the sisters vanished. In 2025, a mild tremor rattled Giles County. It lasted only 3 seconds but cracked the asphalt directly above the old foundation. Drone footage the next morning showed steam venting from the fissure and curling into the shape of 2 interlocking circles before fading. No heat source was found. County engineers patched the road within the day. By nightfall, the patch had sunk again as if something below had exhaled. A week later, a maintenance worker discovered a small iron spoon half embedded in the asphalt, its bowl turned upward. The handle bore no initials, only a shallow groove where letters might have been filed away. He turned it in to the local museum, where the curator stored it in a sealed glass case. Condensation formed instantly on the inside surface, though humidity was controlled. The curator described the moisture pattern as circular, like breath on glass. That same year, an independent filmmaker released a short piece titled The Hollow Kitchen. It combined archival images with new footage shot near the bend. In the closing scene, the camera lingers on a puddle reflecting passing headlights. For a moment, ripples spread outward, though no drop falls. Viewers online noted that the ripples repeated in perfect rhythm. 9 circles, a pause, then 3, matching. The coded marks once etched on the Willet ledger. The film won minor awards for use of atmosphere and disappeared from streaming platforms within a month due to unspecified licensing issues. By 2028, Hollow Bend was fenced off for road stabilization. Workers laying reinforcement mesh found the subsoil unusually compact, as if pressed from beneath. One operator reported his drill bit glowing faintly after withdrawal. Sensors recorded residual heat of 98 degrees, identical to earlier anomalies. Officials blamed friction. The following week, the operator resigned, saying he'd dreamed of 2 women standing beside his truck, each holding a pot lid like a mirror. In 2030, the last printed reference appeared in a state geological bulletin summarizing localized subsurface acoustics. A single sentence near the end reads, "Audible resonance persists at Hollow Bend despite asphalt overlay. Pattern resembles gentle stirring." No follow-up study was authorized. Budget lines moved elsewhere, the file closed. Today, the road remains straight and silent. The mile marker nearest the bend stands slightly tilted, as if leaning toward the creek. Truckers still give a single horn tap, not out of fear, but habit. Those who drive with windows down describe a sudden change in temperature, cool air thickening to warmth, and a smell both savory and sad. It fades within seconds, leaving the metallic taste of memory. Every so often, storm runoff exposes fragments of brick or pottery at the edge of the ditch. County crews collect them and toss them aside, yet within weeks new shards surface, as though the ground refuses completion. Some evenings, when fog drifts across the asphalt, headlights catch faint swirls that move counter to the wind. They spiral once, tighten, vanish. The locals no longer speak the sisters' names aloud, though older residents still leave small bowls of clear water near windows on cold nights. They say it keeps the air from thickening, keeps the hunger settled. No one admits belief, yet none forget the gesture. And so the story endures, not as confession nor as crime, but as an echo of appetite left unfinished. Beneath the pavement, somewhere between soil and stone, the last warmth of the Willet kitchen lingers. When the ground trembles, it is said to be the broth shifting, still hot after all these years, waiting for the final spoon to cool.